Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about a biblical theology of worship. So before we dive into that, we need to unpack that term itself. So the first thing to ask is, what is theology? Theology is the study of God. Okay, cool. So then the question then is, how do we study God? What's our method? So there's several different approaches on how we could do that, but you'll hear about two main ones generally: systematic theology and biblical theology, also called historical theology. So what is biblical theology? Rather than tracing certain subjects through scripture and then summarizing the teaching, which would be systematic theology, biblical theology takes what we call canonical approach to studying God. While recognizing the theological unity and coherence of the canon, biblical theology looks at the theological contributions of the individual books, authors, and redemptive eras. So honestly, that might have sounded a lot like technical babble and jargon, so let's use a metaphor. Imagine like a knitted blanket or a cloth where you can see all of the threads. So what we're going to do is basically pull on one of the threads and trace its path through the whole. We don't want to pull it out completely and isolate it, but we want to follow it through the story and see how it changes as part of the whole. So in this lesson, we want to take a look at what worship has looked like throughout the entire Bible. We want to answer the questions: how have people worshiped God in the past? What can we learn from understanding that past? And ultimately, my hope for today would be that by taking a look at what has always been important to God and what has always been true about his relationship with his people, we will have a more robust understanding and appreciation for what we do now. So let's get into this topic by looking at how the Bible itself uses and defines the word worship. There are three main groups of words in the original languages that are translated as worship in English. They each have their own nuances from which we might glean a little bit of extra information. So the first group of words defines worship as homage or grateful submission to God. So the Hebrew verb that's most commonly translated to worship literally means to bend oneself over at the waist, which was a gesture of respect before someone greater than you, a king, a lord, a master. In the Old Testament, this gesture expressed surrender or submission to the living and true God. But it was meaningful only if it equally expressed a recognition of God's majesty and holiness, as well as a desire to acknowledge him as king. This obviously doesn't mean that the only way to worship God is to bend oneself over at the waist, though that is definitely a warranted response. So what does that mean for us? This group of terms reminds us that our worship is in humility to a holy God, and the posture of our hearts should reflect that. Worship is an act of submission to him. The second group of terms identifies worship as service to God. One of the biblical terms translated to worship literally means to serve. An example of this is to remember that the purpose of Israel's redemption from slavery was to release the people to exclusive service to God rather than being slaves serving the Egyptians. This is often reflected in rituals and festivals, but some passages set Israel's service within the broader framework of fearing God, walking in all of his ways, and observing all his commands and decrees. A total lifestyle of allegiance to God was clearly required of God's people. So, what does that mean for us? Worship is one way that we put into action our total, deep devotion to God. The final group of terms identifies worship as reverence or respect for God. These terms indicate the fear, reverence, or respect due to God. This involved keeping his commandments, obeying his voice, walking in his ways, turning away from evil, and serving him. A key thing to note is that all of these terms indicate activity, not passivity. God has already spoken through his word. He's already worked his will for redemption through Jesus, and so we actively respond with submission, service, respect, obedience. It's not a sprint, but it's definitely something that we are always doing and participating in.